So first, I just want to thank you for the invitation to speak on this topic that is very near and dear to me. I started this work in this area, as I like to say, before it was as popular as it has become, and I'm thrilled that there's more interest in this area. So back 8 years ago, I'm a leadership coach, speaker, facilitator, and about 8 years ago, there was a group that was led by another coach that got together a lot of people that were working in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Back then, it was just diversity and inclusion, and put a whole bunch of us together in a think tank. It was a bit of a co-op, coming up with strategies, assessments, and so forth in this space. Unfortunately, back then, I like to think we were ahead of our time, because when we took it out to the marketplace, with the exception of some unconscious bias training, the workplace was still not ready for this topic, but it was certainly a learning experience. And now that more organizations, as a result of recent events, are more interested in this topic, I'm happy that that experience is serving in this space. And I was saying before, today is a challenging day to give this topic, especially as we wait the verdict of the Derek Chauvin trial. So I feel like I'm holding my breath, but I will do my best as we work through this topic today. So before we get started, what I wanted to share with all of you, just to sort of put us all on the same page, and for some of you this might be obvious, is just some basic definitions. So whenever we start this work, and today I'm just going over the definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the reason why I bring up definitions is because when we do this work, it's important to all of us be on the same page in terms of what we actually mean by that. So when we enter into this space, to have those types of conversations, almost like a Bible of terms, if you will, before we even get into some of these discussions, so that people feel comfortable with the terminology. With so many things changing so quickly, some people sometimes feel it's challenging to even know, am I saying this correctly, incorrectly? What can I say these days? What are the correct terms to use? So that's the reason for also going through these definitions. So when we're talking about diversity, it's the presence of differences, and these differences can include a range of things such as race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, nationality, socioeconomic status, language, disability, age, religious commitment, political perspective. You see the idea. And so diversity of thought is composed by so many different variables. So this is where we want to start the conversation, understanding what diversity is, and the fact that we need to be very conscious of the fact that there still remains underrepresented groups, and that is important for us to understand and acknowledge. When we go into equity, a lot of times people will say to me, well, Carolina, why not equality? Why do you use the term equity? Well, it's really important, again, to acknowledge where people are starting from, and equity is acknowledging the disparities in our community. And if we really look at the research, which is beyond what the scope of today's conversation is, the research is very clear. There are disparities as it relates to certain groups, and that is across many different systems. That's why sometimes when we talk about the term systemic racism, it goes way beyond what we experience on an individual level. It's built into the systems. And so in order for us to be able to properly acknowledge these disparities, we can't just be talking about equality. We have to take the conversation a step further and talk about equity. Equity takes in consideration that we're all starting from a different place. So this is about promoting justice and impartiality and fairness within the procedures, processes, and distribution of resources by institutions or systems. So this is really about tackling equity issues, and we need to understand the root causes. And again, this conversation is beyond today, which is just an introduction about how we can go about starting these diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies in our organizations and the conversations in our organizations. And finally, when it comes to inclusion, this is the outcome of ensuring those that are diverse actually feel and or are welcomed. So we want to make sure that when we extend that reach to include the diversity aspects that we talked about on the first slide, that those feel a sense of belonging. And so that is, again, conceptually might be easy to understand, but as it relates to the culture that we're trying to build, that becomes a little bit harder in terms of implementation and execution. And we could talk more about that as we move along. So where do we start our diversity, equity, and inclusion journey, which is a question I get all the time. So if you're in an organization right now and have been experiencing with everything that's been going on in the past year or so, and really are just at a place like we want to do something, we just have no idea where to start. Well, that is the place that most people are starting from. And I always say that's a great place to start, because there should be no judgment into where we're starting our efforts. We should just be willing to start. What I do share here about the listen, learn, and grow is that a lot of the times what I do experience with organizations is coming from a very well-intentioned place, but we go into fix-it mode. And I want to share the example. For anyone who's ever been in a relationship with anyone, oftentimes when somebody is coming and sharing something with us, they either want us to listen or go into fix-it mode. And most of the time, people want first the listening, the validation of their perspective, of their suffering, of what they're going through. So in the same way, I say to organizations, we have to spend time listening and learning. We can't just jump in and fix it. So getting into strategies too quickly, whether it's diversity, equity, and inclusion statements, diversity, equity, and inclusion committees, or any other well-intentioned strategy, can sometimes be premature before we've given enough time to what I like to call the discovery phase. The discovery phase is where we spend time actually listening, sometimes conducting listening circles with underrepresented groups, so that we can really understand what the issues are. How do we know what our baseline is? How do we know what our issues are? We can make a lot of assumptions when it comes to this area in terms of what the solution should be, like any other issue or problem. Sometimes we want to jump ahead to the solution without spending enough time in the process. And most organizations are very results oriented. And so this is about indulging the process a little bit more, because there's such a gift of insight in the process. So today I wanted to put up a few questions, because again, if we're in that listening mode and we understand that that is the important place to start and to be in, then to ask ourselves questions. And in the same way, today, I don't want to be doing a lot of talking. I wanted to present some content for all of you, but the purpose is to have an opportunity to discuss, to ask questions, to share best practices, for this to be that safe place for all of you to have that opportunity to discuss or to bounce ideas as we collaborate, all of us, on our learning journey as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So these are some of the questions to ask yourself. So is diversity, equity, and inclusion a priority for your leadership team? This is probably the most important question. And I say that because with a lot of organizations, as they're stepping forward to do work in this space, there can be a sense of a lot of pressure from the outside to do something about this. But again, if we jump in and this is not a priority, we're setting ourselves up for failure. And what I mean by that is moving beyond the check the box mentality as it relates to this effort. Because otherwise, the investment of time, of resources, of all your people coming together behind this without the leadership team buy-in, and I've seen this in the companies and organizations that I've been supporting, where it's so important to have that leadership buy-in and to have those conversations before we get into some of that work. So that's the first and foremost. How do we know what our diversity, equity, and inclusion issues are? And this is back to that listening piece, because we make assumptions based on our own perspective. And again, our perspective is biased. We all are. I say, if you have a brain, you're biased. So as a result of that, we need to make sure that when we're looking at what our diversity, equity, and inclusions are, we're bringing everyone to the table. For the way that I tend to recommend that to organizations is to have some form of assessment to take a baseline on a whole variety of different issues, both the people part and the process piece, to be able to assess where are we as an organization, so that we at least understand where we're starting from. And then as time passes, we have something to refer back to. And not only that, when we start creating some goals or some intentions of how we want to move the needle, we have something to work from and to measure our success from when we do get into the phase of articulating strategies, goals, plans, and so forth. Have we assessed, so that really relates to the diversity, equity, and inclusion across the organization, because again, sometimes we might experience pockets of issues and whatnot, and it needs to be, again, not just sometimes a one size fits all. That's something else that I've noticed in organizations, is it's important to assess across the organization, because as we move through this, we might assess that there's certain pockets that need to be addressed in different ways than others. Again, we're not all the same, not all departments are the same. And even though there might be an overall organizational culture as it relates to some of these topics and conversations, you know, sometimes individual insights would come up from different departments and whatnot. So, and again, this question of, have we listened to those most effective, and there's different ways of accomplishing that, but that's what I meant about the listening circles, the assessment, different ways in which we can stay in that discovery phase, so that by the time we get to the point where we can start implementing some solutions, we're coming from a place of being well informed. And the other piece as it relates to this is making sure that the psychological safety of an organization. So having worked with different organizations in assessing their diversity, equity, and inclusion baseline, there's a psychological safety piece that needs to be considered before we go into this. In other words, not everyone in the organization might feel safe speaking up as it relates to the different topics that will be discussed, because there might be fear of retaliation. If there's a lot of information that's being gathered in the assessment, people might feel that there's identifiers tracing back to who's making a comment, fear of retaliation, all of these different things. So how do we mitigate some of that, lessen some of that psychological safety, understanding that also it becomes part of an organization's baseline. So we can only mitigate a certain amount, and then we also have to acknowledge that that's where we're starting from. So how might that impact results? Well, it'll impact the response rate that you might get. It'll impact the type of engagement you might have in some listening circles or other strategies as it relates to the discovery phase. So even those who will step forward will be potentially few and far between in the beginning. And so organizations have to also acknowledge and be sort of realistic, depending on the psychological safety of an organization, where we are. Have we looked at the inherent biases of all our systems and processes? So that is everything from, again, our hiring, our recruitment, our succession planning, how we, there's different processes within an organization, and depending on which department we're looking at, those were just HR related, but there's so many others that can be across an organization, or sometimes industry specific, depending on how that particular industry operates. There's certain industries where gender parity is more of an issue than others, and where it's a little bit harder to where we're tackling one disparity more than the other, for example. So we need to be able to look at those systems and processes and be very honest with ourselves. And then again, have the leadership team be able to take that information in. And that's not always easy, because as human beings, again, we can get defensive. We can get defensive and not necessarily want to look at, the things that it's easier to look at our strengths than it is to look at our areas of development. And I see this as a journey, and we continue, all of us, to be on this journey of learning, whether it relates to this space or another. The other piece is training. So I remember when the George Floyd murder happened, and so many organizations were wanting to be doing something. It was a very reactive time, and my phone started ringing with, can you do unconscious bias training? Can you do training? Can you do training? And my response was, and of course, as somebody who's been in this space for a long time and hadn't seen that type of engagement before, that can be very exciting. But what I also wanted people to be, the cautionary part that I was sharing with folks is, well, let's first start to look at whether or not individuals have the type of skills to be able to handle difficult conversations, conflict. Diversity of thought or diversity in any form is going to bring conflict. And even conflict, we have a different relationship with conflict and how we all approach conflict. So to throw somebody into unconscious bias training without the skills to then have the difficult conversations that come with that type of information can be very challenging. And so what I was calling it at the time is, you know, we shouldn't be promoting this hit and run type of learning within organizations, and understand that we are on a journey as it relates to this. So when I was asking folks, okay, we can do unconscious bias training, but then how will you support your individuals after that, so that they feel that we're not just giving them all this information and then they don't have the tools, because it can feel that way at times. Or even, do they have the foundational skill set to be able to have these conversations? And then how do we cultivate a more inclusive culture where everyone feels like they belong and we promote allyship? And in this part, of course, it's different for every organization, but it's about being very intentional with this part. If we leave it up to chance or to individual behaviors or the way that all of us can respond to these topics with our own perspective on it, rather than coming together and creating some structure and some almost formal ways in which we will stand up for one another. What I mean by that is, if, this is a very small example, but it can start to be the beginning of creating some structure around this, is we've often been in a meeting where somebody's voice is somewhat neglected or unheard. Somebody might have a great idea, and then 20 minutes later it's repeated by someone else, and all of a sudden it's adopted as the best thing and we're moving forward without even acknowledging that that idea was brought up 20 minutes earlier by that potentially underrepresented voice. And so if we start acknowledging the moments when those inequities or disparities show up in as small a thing as a voice in a meeting, and start creating ways in which we can create that allyship, it starts to build. And again, it's different for every organization. So stop me if there's any questions. I feel like there might be something in the chat room, so I want to address it. So Carol B says, we're just starting the whole diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. And I think currently a very logical question pops up. How can I encourage my leadership team to have explicit conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion? So great question. This is the place to start. And I think how to encourage the leadership team. So first of all, I usually say we start with, or what I like to do is start with one person at a time. And what I mean by that is, when you get everyone in a group, then group think starts to take over, versus the leadership team is usually composed of, again, diverse people with diverse opinions and perspectives. So we want to acknowledge where everybody is at in the journey. So first I would take each person individually before we start having conversations with them together. And in those individual conversations, we can start assessing whether or not we feel that there's going to be any barriers. What are some of the assumptions people making? What are some of the just even biases or microaggressions that might be showing up with individuals? So there's all of that takes place. I'll give you an example. Somebody said to me as a part of a leadership team once, I can't keep track with all the acronyms that are being said. So rather than, that in and of itself was like, okay, well, let's take this as a learning opportunity, rather than being frustrated with this process, or frustrated with, letters that could be being added, whether it's the LGBTQIA+ community or BIPOC, whatever. So we want to be able to understand how people are experiencing this, to be able to provide the appropriate learning opportunities for them. So that's what I would say to the first question. How do you get the data to see where you're at? That would be the assessment piece. So you start an assessment and you kind of move forward from there. And actually, before I start getting to all the questions, I think what would help is if I put up this visual about assessing things. And this is at least the process that I move through with an organization. So to Carol B's question is, we have to make sure that it's a priority at the top. I can't stress that enough, and that we're having enough conversations. And that priority piece can take some time with certain organizations, because again, we're all at different places. The leadership team might be at a different place. Some people might think it's important, others don't. Why are we doing this? Is this the latest fad? Or, you know, I've heard so many different things. So the creating that alignment is so, so important. And not only that, creating a team that is well versed in the terminology and in the language that we need to be using, so that when they're trying to make these changes, sure, we're going to make mistakes. That is inevitable. And I say embrace that part, that we're going to fall down, we're going to make mistakes, and we're going to get up. But as much as possible to avoid that, even as we're taking on these important topics and challenges, that we're avoiding microaggressions even in the way that we're approaching our team. So for example, they said to me as a consultant, oh, I'm so frustrated with all of these acronyms and whatnot, it's so confusing. Okay, we'll share that in the closed space, but when we're talking to the entire staff, let's be a little bit more informed or get educated on those things, so that when we are then rolling this out as an organization, we have more information. So again, it's okay to be wherever we're starting from, as long as we're okay with, we're going to be learning, and that we're committed to that journey of learning. So after that, this is the piece where it starts to split off into two areas, where I like to look at it as individual change and then organizational change, where the organizational change comes in all these different processes that we're looking at, whether it's, again, the HR piece, whether it's things of employee resource groups, diversity, equity, inclusion committees, mentoring, coaching, sponsoring, how we look at customer service. It can be very different depending on the organization, depending on the industry, and so forth. This is where, once we have had enough conversations and we've sat in that space a little bit of time, we can move towards what we will actually assess. That to Tracy's question is, how do you get the data to see where you're at? Then you can launch an organization-wide assessment. Now, the assessment looks at all these different areas. It looks at the leadership team's commitment to change. It looks at all these different systems to make sure, how are your people perceiving these different areas? Whether it's leadership's commitment to this diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether it's how, how we deal with certain processes, whether it's succession planning, do we see enough diversity in the leadership team? There's a myriad of questions that we can go and move through in the assessment. And that usually what I do is I work with the HR, the internal team that's assigned as the executive sponsor, to come up with what we're going to be assessing. Now, I always say, if we're going to assess it, is because once we get a response, we're also ready to embark on a solution for it. In other words, we don't assess things that we're not ready to look at. And that is also part of the conversation of getting people to look at that change is coming, and that we need to commit to change in these areas, that we're not just measuring things for the sake of measuring them. That doesn't mean we have to do everything overnight. And so, because that's impossible, and when you try to do everything, irrespective of what the area is, then we're just spinning our wheels, and then we don't do anything effectively. So, but we need to make sure that we're intentional about wanting to assess where we're at in many different areas. And then we are committed to making change, even if that change is incremental and small. The other piece, so I want to make sure that I get to, let's see, Kate's question, how can we include diversity, equity, inclusion agenda into our job descriptions and interview processes while hiring? Beautiful. So I think this piece is a two-step process. I think there's the language piece, like, the terms that we use, even when it's a small way that we can introduce a term into our descriptions and so forth, can have huge impact. Then as it relates to being able to decrease whatever biases are inherent in that process. So for example, there's a study that's done as it relates to resumes. So when resumes have certain names versus not, I forget what the name of that study was right now, but basically saying that, more ethnically sounding names were falling on lower on the pile of resumes versus more non-ethnic white type names. And so there's a lot of research that's been done in this area. So that's one, if we think about names, if we think about appearances, and what else are the biases that are inherent in these processes, and being able to identify them, then bringing together the people and the groups that will be able to mitigate that. So if it's reading a job description, making sure that it's not just one person that is writing that job description. Do we have several lenses on it to be able to offer that diversity perspective? Have we chosen the right terms? That intentionality piece is so important. So hopefully that answers Kate's question. Again, you can keep them coming in the chat and I'll get to them in that order. Then if we move forward to the individual piece, I want to make sure that I share that there's the awareness piece as it relates to making sure that we understand our behavior changes. But again, as it relates to the awareness, there's the individual piece and then there's the organizational piece. So under here, I'm talking about individual behavior changes, where we start acknowledging what our biases are and we start being intentional in the workplace about mitigating those. And again, conceptually easy. It's easy to understand bias. I'm going to mitigate bias, but it's much harder to start unpacking what are all those areas where we do have these inherent biases, and what strategies are we going to be intentional about putting into place so that we mitigate it. And that means combing through everything that we've been doing in the past that we think might have been working, and to adopt a different lens on it. The taking action piece, though, we also want to make sure this is back to giving folks tools, resources. We can't expect people to step into action after they've had 1 or 2 trainings and be able to expect them to, first of all, change. I mean, think of any time you wanted to change any kind of habit and the amount of effort or work that it takes to change a habit. These are ingrained behaviors that we've had for lifetimes, that from a very young age, that again, it becomes part of who we are. And sometimes the reason why we call them unconscious is because we have blind spots around it. So then to even become aware of that, then to have the tools to be able to mitigate that, again, there's a lot that needs to take place, and rather than sort of this, let's get to that solution, and let's, that hit and run approach, as I refer to it often. This allyship piece is what I referred to before, is how do we create that framework or that structure around how we're going to create allyship. I gave one example, but there's many examples. I also talk, I gave a talk on breaking the glass ceiling just a couple of days ago, and I was mentioning how when it comes to women are over mentored and under sponsored. So in organizations, do we have employee resource groups that look about, and sponsorship where you have someone advocating on your behalf of your career is very different from somebody who's advising you on behalf of your career. So can we create structures onto, in this case, it was for women. How do we have more women sponsored so that they can reach that C-suite positions, occupy those board positions and so forth? So how do we do that intentionally? Because it's not just going to happen. So there's many different examples depending on the groups, depending on again, the underrepresented groups that we're looking at. How do we create that allyship? But it's about frameworks and it's about being intentional. And the assessment piece, which I've already addressed, which is how do we understand where we're starting from, so that when we get to the part of creating a strategic plan around diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we are taking each piece that has been identified as a priority from the results of our assessment, I like to include listening circles, because the assessment will only give you, sometimes you don't have that open-ended ability in the same way you do when you have listening circles, where you can dig deeper into insights, into ways that that certain questions, where there's interpretation, where there's room for interpretation rather than making assumptions. So that's a framework that I share with my clients. It's not by all means the only way to work through things, but it's a clear way that I like to present to my clients. So to give them, again, where do we start with this? Because we need to understand how can we move through this process or through this journey. So let's see. I'm looking at, I want to make sure that I've addressed everyone's questions. I'm looking at Renata, who says, how can we improve diversity, equity, and inclusion among senior management when turnover at this level is low? Yes. So agreed. And I think in this, depending on the organization and the industry, there can also be, I call it's generational issues. And in other words, I was saying to, when I was giving this talk again, a lot, women were given the right to vote in 1920s, and that's not that long ago. And if we really think about then people of color, it was in 1965. So when we start thinking that it's going to take a long time for sometimes the type of change that maybe we'd all like to see, or some of us would like to see it. So that's why it's not about this overnight. I like to think of it as small and incremental change. So when I work with an organization and I'm working with the leadership team, sometimes the questions is, what are we willing to do? What are we willing to do? What do you think would be necessary? And that's why back to talking to each person individually and having a place to start. So, and of course, my job is always to push. In other words, if somebody tells me this is what I'm willing to do, if I was a weight loss coach and somebody's like, I'm willing to exercise 1 time a week, I might say, well, how about 2? Can we get you to 2? So in the same way, as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm going to have some of those difficult conversations with individuals to say, I understand that that's where you are, and that probably represents your comfort zone. Can I push you just a little bit out of that comfort zone to get you to think about it in this way? And if I get you to think about it in this way, then this is the outcome. And I think when people can start tying things to outcome, because what happens in this space is when we don't understand the space, we don't understand what some of these putting the time, energy, financial resources in this space can create. What types of outcomes can we see? When we focus on that, both at an organizational level and then from a community expanding out, how can we create change systemically? And when people can embrace that, because I believe that at the core, everyone wants, and that's why I was saying people have good intentions, people want to create change, people want to do good. Sometimes it's just having that roadmap of how to do that. And working with senior management individually can sometimes get you there. At least that's been my experience. So I think that I've had an opportunity. I want to stop there. I'm sharing my contact information for anyone who wants to reach out, but I want to make this a conversation where I look at questions, or if you want to unmute yourselves and jump in, so that it's not just a one-way conversation. So Kate Deborah says, as the HR leader and the only person of color, how can I initiate diversity and inclusion movement, not making it perceived as a personal matter? Yes. Listen, I'm not going to say it in any other way. This is very challenging. I've been in a situation where that was also the case. And what's very what can be very challenging in that perspective is that because that person becomes the voice, right? And that's not the position that you want to put yourself in, even if you are in HR. So what I would say there is, although I usually discourage having a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee until we're further down the line, even if you don't call it a diversity, equity, inclusion committee, call it ambassadors in the beginning, call it a team of people that are interested in helping you move this forward. You need that. I highly recommend tapping the shoulders of different people in the organization that at least have a willingness. That doesn't mean that they're all going to see it the way that you do. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to have this perspective that you do, but they will at least be committed to the journey. Or then the external support, right? Whether it's a consultant or whoever can be your external support, because it needs to be more than you, because you don't want to put yourself in that position, and that can have a lot of negative repercussions, not only for the individual, for the process. So you want, and like anything else, you want diverse opinions, perspectives at the table, because whenever you're discussing anything, the last thing any person wants to become is the spokesperson, for all people of color or for whatever underrepresented group that you're referring to. We don't want to put ourselves in that situation. We need a group of people committed to the journey, committed to the process. Any other questions, or does anyone want to jump in with something that might be working really well in their organization? What are best practices to transition from a white culture to a culture of equity and inclusion? So this is something that I say to boards. Boards are typically, or have been, typically on the older side, typically white. And so when I've worked with boards that have this issue, I say one person at a time, right? And I've worked with boards that when I've started, there was zero diversity, if you will, and then throughout the years have created. So it's about not expecting change to happen overnight, and those small incremental steps, and identifying what's one way. So if I stick to the board example that I just gave, well, hiring, if it's all men of a certain age, then hiring the first woman, or being very intentional about maybe a woman of color, or whatever the case might be. What's your diversity of thought in this scenario, and making sure that we're intentional about creating that space for that different perspective. And guess what? And if that person is willing, again, I'm sticking to this example, to join that, it's because they know that they're going to be playing a role in shaking things up. So what happens when you're introducing that person into the group, assuming they don't leave, is you have that change that starts, and it creates the momentum for more change. So small, if I could leave you with anything, is small incremental change. And sometimes small change has a big impact. Sometimes we think just because we're moving the needle, it doesn't mean that it's going to have a small impact. Small changes can have big impact, but they're easier for us to commit to as human beings. Any other questions or thoughts? I'm going to stop sharing so we could all see ourselves, and just if anyone wants to jump in with either a question or a best practice. This was very helpful. Can I get a copy of the slides? I'm going to leave that to the team to be able to share that with you. I have no objections to them sharing my slides.
Thank you so much, Carolina. We will definitely share the slides with you guys, and thank you so much for your questions. Being active and finding out more about this topic is definitely very helpful. Carolina, I have a question actually. So recently I faced quite many objections on the US market, and it happened so that these days candidates would even hide their surnames from their CVs. Not to say that they already hide their pictures, just in order to be considered and not to be discriminated. What do you think about it? And do you think it's a real threat to leave your surname being a person of some specific ethnicity?
Well, what I would say is that to me, it's important to show up to work being all of who we are, whether that is ethnic or any aspect of diversity. And my question would be to candidates is, do you want to work for an organization where you feel that you need to hide any aspect of who you are? We're creating the type of cultures where that separation no longer exists, and the younger generations, in fact, expect it. So even for some of us who might have started, in the workforce, I'm Gen X, with more separation earlier on in our careers between, this is my personal life, this is my professional life, that is becoming so integrated. So to the candidates, I would say and to everyone, we need to be more and show up more authentically of who we are. And it's for organizations too, to catch up to that. In other words, what do we do to embrace that change, to embrace that culture, understanding that we may have started from more conservative perspectives, for lack of a better word. And I don't use that word in a judgmental way. I use that word in, many of us were raised with certain ideas, and those ideas are no longer applicable, or no longer serve us, or are no longer part of the reality of the world that we live in. I had a mother who wasn't allowed to work because of the gender roles, right? So the world has changed. So I say embrace that, and the more that we can do to be transparent.
Wow.
Tracy's saying something that has worked for us has been to use blind resumes when giving the department the resumes. Right. So if that will eliminate, yes, so that the blind aspect is to mitigate the bias piece of it, right? So that's at the organization side. I don't encourage individuals to do that, but as an organization, if we would have any, and again, that's acknowledging that whether it's the HR team or the panel or whoever's going to be involved in those decisions or discussions, that we have inherent biases, right? And it can work in either way. And we tend to prefer like prefers like. So we tend to prefer people who look like us and talk. That is a brain, that is a neuroscience foundation. So anything that will, again, from an organization perspective, mitigate that. The individual should have that opportunity to show up authentically.
This is actually so great to always remember that it's not only about like ethnical diversity, but it's also about the diversity of, you know, views, backgrounds, and whatever it is, mindset, and so on and so forth. The list can go on and on. But yeah, indeed, isn't it so that if we want our organizations to succeed, at some point we are going to need to face some change, at least to hire somebody with a different corporate DNA, right? Because that's a type of diversity that we also are lacking in a way.
Absolutely. So one thing that I say to organizations all the time is we've heard in the past is, you know, we hire for fit. And that term, which before used to say, which fit would then mean somebody that technically thinks like us, or, you know, it insinuates a lack of diversity, whether it's diversity of thought, even at whatever level. So this and you know, we know that there's different types of biases, like confirmation bias, you know, wanting to have others that affirm what we think, what we believe. So this idea of even hiring for fit, we have to challenge that. And we know that you know, certainly if you're in the innovation or tech space or whatnot, then you know that you need to have a diversity of thought and different ideas in the way that you approach things. And by making sure that we go there, we also have to be comfortable with conflict, because, you know, I tell folks, where did we learn that conflict is not normal? If you've ever been in any kind of relationship, mother, father, personal relation, you know, love interest, whatever, conflict is a normal part of life. What we have to do is have productive conflict and get very good at resolving things. And diversity introduces conflict, and conflict within the professional space is usually something that we avoid. We want to be nice. So that would just be how I would address that piece.
Wow, this has been very interesting, and I would say useful. It feels like everybody is absorbing this information so much, and hopefully that's a great step forward for, you know, for change that we're all seeking.
And I love that people are sharing, again, this idea of sharing best practices with one another. What are you doing that works? How can we do that? How can we adopt these practices, and having that space for that? So that's great.
Totally. All right. I think it was a great session, guys. Hope you think so too. We have the recording and we have the slides, and we will make sure that everybody has all the information after the event. And let's hope that diversity is going to be rather our everyday than something that we need to have an event about, isn't it?
Agreed. May we live in a world where eventually this is no longer a topic of conversation. It just,
yeah, rather celebrate it, as we always say. Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you for the
Absolutely
invitation.
great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening and day.